What had you been doing?
I had been studying.
Why had she been crying?
She had been feeling sad.
Who had they been helping?
They had been helping their friends.
Where had you been living?
I had been living in New York.
When had you been traveling?
I had been traveling last year.
Which project had you been working on?
I had been working on my science project.
Why had he been waiting so long?
He had been waiting for his ride.
What had you been thinking about?
I had been thinking about my exam.
Who had she been talking to?
She had been talking to her mother.
Where had you been going every day?
I had been going to the gym.
Why had they been arguing?
They had been disagreeing about something.
What had he been cooking?
He had been cooking pasta.
Where had you been studying?
I had been studying at the library.
Who had they been expecting?
They had been expecting a guest.
Why had she been feeling tired?
She had been working all day.
Which movie had you been watching?
I had been watching a horror movie.
What had you been planning?
I had been planning a trip.
Where had you been meeting him?
I had been meeting him at the park.
When had he been practicing?
He had been practicing in the morning.
Why had you been avoiding me?
I had been feeling unwell.
What had they been discussing?
They had been discussing a project.
Who had she been texting?
She had been texting her best friend.
Where had you been working before?
I had been working at a restaurant.
Why had they been laughing?
They had been laughing at a joke.
What had you been drinking?
I had been drinking lemonade.
When had you been visiting your grandma?
I had been visiting her last weekend.
Which game had he been playing?
He had been playing basketball.
Who had they been waiting for?
They had been waiting for their teacher.
Where had you been jogging?
I had been jogging around the neighborhood.
What had you been eating?
I had been eating a sandwich.
Why had he been skipping classes?
He had been feeling sick.
When had they been practicing for the concert?
They had been practicing every evening.
Who had she been visiting last weekend?
She had been visiting her grandparents.
Why had they been avoiding each other?
They had been having a disagreement.
What had you been painting?
I had been painting a landscape.
Where had he been shopping?
He had been shopping at the mall.
Why had you been staying up late?
I had been studying for my exams.
Who had they been playing with?
They had been playing with their cousins.
Which book had you been reading?
I had been reading a mystery novel.
What had she been listening to?
She had been listening to music.
Why had he been driving so fast?
He had been late for work.
Where had they been hanging out?
They had been hanging out at the beach.
When had you been practicing the piano?
I had been practicing in the afternoon.
What had you been writing about?
I had been writing about my trip.
Why had she been calling you?
She had been needing some advice.
Who had you been chatting with?
I had been chatting with my friend Jack.
Where had they been hiding?
They had been hiding in the basement.
What had he been fixing?
He had been fixing his bike.
Why had she been working overtime?
She had been saving for a vacation.
When had you been going to the gym?
I had been going every morning.
Who had you been emailing?
I had been emailing my teacher.
What had they been planning for the weekend?
They had been planning a picnic.
Why had he been feeling upset?
He had been going through a tough time.
When had you been cleaning your room?
I had been cleaning it before dinner.
Which subject had you been struggling with?
I had been struggling with math.
Who had you been taking care of?
I had been taking care of my dog.
What had you been dreaming about?
I had been dreaming about traveling.
Why had they been missing classes?
They had been on vacation.
Where had you been buying groceries?
I had been buying them at the local store.
What had she been preparing for dinner?
She had been preparing pasta.
Why had you been staying home all week?
I had been feeling sick.
When had they been painting the house?
They had been painting it last week.
What had you been learning in class?
I had been learning about world history.
Who had you been borrowing books from?
I had been borrowing books from the library.
Why had she been working on weekends?
She had been catching up on work.
What had they been arguing about?
They had been arguing about a game.
Where had you been taking dance lessons?
I had been taking lessons at a studio.
When had you been visiting Jack?
I had been visiting him on Saturday.
Why had he been missing soccer practice?
He had been injured.
What had they been organizing?
They had been organizing a party.
Where had she been taking pictures?
She had been taking pictures at the zoo.
Who had you been playing games with?
I had been playing games with my siblings.
What had you been making for breakfast?
I had been making pancakes.
Why had he been working late?
He had been finishing a project.
Which movie had you been looking forward to?
I had been looking forward to the new action movie.
Who had they been inviting to the event?
They had been inviting their classmates.
Where had you been taking swimming lessons?
I had been taking lessons at the pool.
When had you been visiting the museum?
I had been visiting it last month.
Why had she been feeling nervous?
She had been preparing for an interview.
What had they been searching for?
They had been searching for their lost keys.
Where had you been camping?
I had been camping in the mountains.
Who had you been practicing tennis with?
I had been practicing with my brother.
Why had he been skipping meals?
He had been too busy to eat.
What had they been doing all morning?
They had been cleaning the house.
When had you been sending emails?
I had been sending them last night.
Where had she been training for the marathon?
She had been training at the park.
What had he been drawing?
He had been drawing a portrait.
Who had you been calling yesterday?
I had been calling my friend.
Why had you been feeling down?
I had been going through some personal issues.
Where had they been going for dinner?
They had been going to an Italian restaurant.